Whenever there's a murder, it's the job of detectives to find out who the killer is and how they killed. And often, it's forensic evidence which provides the clues.
Each bit of information delivers that to the whole jigsaw.
I was able to test that sample and I got a DNA profile.
There's no doubt at all that forensics were absolutely crucial in this case.
In this series, we shine a light on how cutting-edge forensic techniques and the power of science were able to bring some of our most dangerous and despicable killers to justice.
This was such an unnatural crime.
It's not a question of if he will kill again, it's a question of when.
He believed that he was invincible and that nothing could stop him.
We'll hear how some of the toughest and most disturbing crimes were solved thanks to the tiniest fragments of evidence.
When you begin a forensic investigation, you don't know what you're going to find.
The officer plunged his hand into loose soil and actually felt cold flesh.
From the type of insects that were around, she'd been dead for at least 5 years.
And how even the most forensically aware of killers couldn't beat the experts and hide their crimes.
You know, if he comes out, heaven help somebody, because he is a dangerous, dangerous man.
In this episode, the savage murders of 3 teenage girls leaves communities in South Wales terrified.
This wasn't a person, this wasn't a human being, this was some fiend, some monster.
The case goes cold for almost 30 years, until a forensic breakthrough.
It was groundbreaking. This was the very first time in the world that this had been done.
Science might have identified a serial killer. Now, will evidence from beyond the grave prove they found the murderer?
Witnesses who were present at the exhumation say that when the first shovel went in the ground, there was a huge clap of thunder, and they were unearthing evil.
This is forensics, catching the killer.
I was a young detective, or a temporary detective at the time, just got on to CID, working in a police station probably about 20 miles north of here. But on the day that the bodies were found, this would have been full of police officers. This would have been obviously the main area to start the investigation.
In 1973, Wyn Phillips was one of many officers being drafted into the Port Talbot area from across South Wales to assist with a murder case unlike any other seen locally until that time.
So uniformed police officers would form lines. They would be scouring the area, examining the area for any clues, any weapons, anything that may be of evidential value, and anything that could add value to the investigation.
The bodies of 2 teenage girls had been found in woods near a main road. Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd were just 16 years old. Both were normal teenagers living with their families in Neath and Llandarcy, and both had been subjected to a terrible and brutal attack.
Both girls were found having been raped and with rope tied around their neck.
Journalist Martin Shipton, who's worked the South Wales patch for nearly 30 years, remembers the story.
Pauline's body was found with her face down, and she had been strangled with a 5-foot rope, and she'd also been battered, so the clothing was heavily blood-stained. Geraldine's body was found a few yards away, which has led to speculation that the killer had to run after her to catch her. You know, perhaps she was trying to escape, but obviously he was able to outrun her and overpower her. There was also evidence that because there was mud on their feet, that the killer, had allowed them to dress again afterwards. So they were able to put their stockings on. And you know, one can only speculate about exactly what the circumstances were.
There may very well have been screams, but if you look around, who would have heard them? You know, the chances of them being seen in that area at that time of night were very remote. He probably knew that, and that's why he brought them here. This had never been seen before. Double murder of two 16-year-old girls in this area. The community outraged. It was a terrible, terrible day, wasn't it, to find two bodies, two young girls who'd been out the night before and had never got home.
It was a crime that shook tight-knit communities across the whole of South Wales.
The nearest town to Pauline and Geraldine was Port Talbot, where there was a huge steelworks. In 1973, the steelworks alone was employing about 13,000 people. It was a very working-class town. Lots of people had come to work there from other places in Wales and even further afield. So a lot of people were around, but it was a very friendly sort of place, and it was a sort of place where people would leave their doors open, and neighbours would be in and out of each other's houses, you know, typical working-class community.
Sharon Morgan was only 14 years old at the time of the murders. She knew both girls well.
We lived in this world that was good. You know, it was a good world until that night. And that morning, the world was no longer a good world. Geraldine and Pauline were friends of mine. Geraldine was my cousin. She'd become my cousin in March 1973, because my mother's sister had married Geraldine's brother. So we weren't just friends then, we were also cousins. But Geraldine and Pauline and me were in the same school together. So we made friends through the school, but they were a little bit older than me. Geraldine had a music set, you know, like a player, in her back room in the parlour, and she used to learn the words to the songs, and she would sing them with a brush in her hand, and we all enjoyed. You know, it was just fun, and she was a lovely girl. She was full of life. Pauline was a beautiful girl. She was lovely, and she loved clothes and fashion and makeup, and she was lovely too. So the night that they went to the top rank, I was on my way down to the Neath Fair on the bus, and I saw them on the opposite side to the bus stop. Waved to them because I was on the bus going to the fair. And then I never saw them again.
Geraldine and Pauline's regular Saturday night out together would be their last. The concern for both police and the terrified towns and villages of the South Wales Valleys was that this maniac was one of their own.
I mean, was that killer living amongst the community? Was the killer known to the two girls? Could it have been somebody who was working in the area at the time the M4 was being built? The steelworks employed loads of people. There were, you know, there were men travelling back and forth.
Everyone was afraid, because this man wasn't just someone who'd killed someone in a rage or, you know, a family argument. This man had killed 2 girls, 16-year-old girls. What else was he capable of doing? What kind of monster was this person? So the fear was horrendous. You know, this wasn't a person, this wasn't a human being, this was some fiend, some monster, or you couldn't even put a face to him. He was just so evil, and evil was there, and it was in the community.
In 1973, South Wales was rocked by a sickening double murder. The bodies of teenagers Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd had been found strangled to death in woods near a main road. Both had been raped. The friends had last been seen on a night out in Swansea. Their usual routine would have been to catch the bus into town and then hitchhike the short 7-mile drive home to the village of Llandarcy.
For 2 16-year-old girls in the early 70s, the attitude to life was very carefree. So if they wanted to go to the big city of Swansea, they would just factor in, if you like, the fact that they would have to hitchhike back, and they wouldn't think about it. They wouldn't think about the potential danger. It was something that a lot of young girls did, and they wouldn't even consider that it was a matter of risk. You know, they would just do it.
In 1973, investigating a double murder and rape in a normally sleepy part of South Wales was not something local police had much experience of. But one thing they did know, the killer was still at large.
It could have been somebody from outside. It was the uncertainty and the fact that could this person strike again? That's always in the back of people's minds. And, you know, I think that women, and especially young people, probably were more concerned about their safety after this incident happened, because they realised by thumbing a lift home, it could end your life.
One of the problems was that there were a potentially huge number of suspects as a result of various factors. The steelworks alone employed 13,000 men, so technically they could all be suspects in the case. There was a lot of construction going on at the time, so there were lots of itinerant workers who didn't necessarily come from the local area who were working there, and tracking those people down was a huge task. And then also it just so happened that the time of the murder coincided with the Neath Fair, which is something that attracts people from quite a long way.
With no CCTV in 1973, investigators relied on eyewitnesses to piece together Pauline and Geraldine's last known movements. Luckily, someone came forward.
The last sighting of the 2 girls alive was near the top rank in Swansea, where they were seen getting into an Austin 1100, which was white, which was driven by somebody who wasn't entirely visible to the witness who saw him and saw the girls getting into the car.
Who was the mystery driver who picked the girls up outside the Top Rank nightclub that night? Was he the killer?
Later on, a car of the same description was seen in the vicinity of the area where they were found in a lay-by. So that meant that there was an extremely strong possibility that the killer was the driver of this Austin 1100. That gave the police a bit of a break, but of course the Austin 1100 was a very popular car at the time. They were having to trawl through all of these owners of Austin 1100s in the vicinity, but also further afield as well, which was hugely challenging in terms of the manpower that they had to use in order to carry out these various investigations and these interviews with the car owners.
So we were keen to establish who in the area owned a white 1100. And there was a set questionnaire that we took with us to visit owners of white 1100s and ask them the questions. Obviously, did they own the vehicle? Where was the vehicle? Where were they during the relevant time?
As well as trying to track down the car to find out who was driving it, police also knew it could contain important forensic evidence, such as bloodstains that could suggest signs of foul play.
What could have been done in 1973? Well, I think I'd start by saying that even by today's standards, the standard of examination was exemplary. But of course, we didn't have DNA.
The examinations of the cars failed to find blood, so they began looking for other forensic clues that could link the vehicle to the crime. Fibres from Geraldine and Pauline's clothes.
They looked at all of the vehicles, all of the white 1100 vehicles that were around the area at the time, and fibre tapings were taken of the seats to actually try to put the victims into the vehicle. So very straightforwardly, we'd probably use some adhesive tape to dab it onto the seats, pick off the tape, and look at it under a microscope. A little bit in the same way as you would do if you were removing lint from a jumper. Regrettably, they missed out on the most important vehicle.
But despite inquiries to thousands of people and travelling hundreds of miles around the UK to find the elusive Austin 1100 car, no fibres were found and no further clues came to light. It was as if the killer had simply vanished.
They just really reached a dead end. I mean, there was just nowhere else for them to go. They didn't have any forensic evidence that they would be able to use to check against individuals that they were interviewing. And the only eyewitness who saw anything at all was the person who saw the girls getting into an Austin 1100, but there wasn't a sufficiently good description of the individual who was driving the car for them to be able to track that person down. There was no number plate or anything like that.
But at the time, it was basically a paper-based system that, in some respects, caused more problem because you generated all this information, all these different people who could be deemed as persons of interest, but there was no way of actually putting everything together, checking every piece of information, the intelligence that was coming in, because obviously the police rely on intelligence as well in cases like this. There was no DNA in those days. Forensic science wasn't the way it is now. So they would have made a decision that perhaps they should run it down. Fortunately, the papers, the incident room statements, cards, all the information that came in was retained at Sandfields Police Station, and the clothing of the girls was retained along with other crime scene items.
The samples were taken from both Geraldine and Pauline. They were stored meticulously, I have to say, all those years ago.
Unbeknown to police at the time, there was more forensic evidence that could help solve this double murder. It had been collected from the body of another young girl, just 15 years old, which had been found not far from Geraldine and Pauline's bodies, in a remote hillside spot only 2 months earlier. She too had never made it home after a Saturday night out, and she too had been raped and strangled. Could the same person have killed all 3 girls? By late 1973, a double murder investigation of 2 teenage girls had gone cold. Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd were savagely raped and murdered on their way home from a night out in nearby Swansea. But just 2 months earlier, in July of that year, another girl never made it home from her night out either. Her body was found 3 days later in a remote spot in the hills near Port Talbot. She too had been raped and strangled to death.
So what we know about Sandra Newton is that she was 15 years of age. She was from Neath. She'd been out in a nightclub in Britton Ferry, which is a few miles away, and after being in the nightclub, she met her boyfriend. And then after meeting him, she was hitchhiking home, and that was when she was abducted by the murderer. Sandra Newton had been raped. She had been choked to death with her own skirt and left in a culvert which was close to a disused colliery called Tonmawr. And the police at the time came to the conclusion that the murderer was somebody local because the area where she was dumped was pretty remote, and it's not the sort of place that someone who was a random visitor from outside would have known about.
A very unusual case for that area of Neath. You know, in that time there wasn't that many murders in that area, especially a sexually motivated strangulation of a young girl. But at that time, I have to say, there was no link made between Sandra and the 2 girls who were found in September, Geraldine and Pauline.
One thing that linked the investigations into the murders of Geraldine and Pauline with that of Sandra was that bodily samples and clothing were taken from all the victims and perfectly stored for years to come.
There would have been blood samples, fingernail scrapings, that type of examination. And of course the clothing from the victims.
With no new developments or realisation at the time that these murders could be linked, the investigations were wound down until 1999, when South Wales Police started to review some of its unsolved serious crimes. By then, there had been some major advances in forensic science, and in particular, the use of DNA.
In the late 90s, in the case of Geraldine and Pauline, and indeed Sandra, they were able to locate the underwear of the girls and all the clothing, for that matter, that was retained. And they were able to look at the semen stains and obviously the body fluids on the clothing. We had developed a strategy to look at old cases in the light of new technology to see what we could do to investigate undetected murder investigations from the years gone by.
Wynne and his team now called in the help of Home Office forensic scientists.
The advances in science had become such that we were able to generate DNA from these the samples that we'd got from the time, the samples from the victims, the clothing from victims, and of course they matched together. So at that stage we didn't know who the potential perpetrator might be, but what we did know was the cases matched. That was discovered because the DNA from what had ever been collected from the scene, from the victims themselves and from the victims' clothing, DNA matched the one male individual. So at that time we knew that it was the same person who killed Sandra, Pauline and Geraldine.
In 2001, after more than a quarter of a century, forensic science had been able to connect the crimes to the same brutal killer.
So that was quite a breakthrough. It was you know, you realise then that, you know, this is a serial killer. He hadn't killed just one, he'd killed 3, and on 2 separate occasions, just months apart, which again was probably the first for South Wales Police to deal with what we found ourselves with a serial killer.
And yet the murders of this first serial killer, the ones known of at least, had taken place nearly 30 years earlier. But by now, the national database had been set up, listing all the DNA profiles of anyone who had been in police custody since 1995.
So we called a meeting of pathologists, we called a meeting of forensic scientists, all the experts, and the pathologist from 1973 who had conducted the postmortems on the 3 girls, any scientists who were still left from 1973. So we all met in police headquarters in Bridgend and talked it through, went over the July incident, the September double murder.
But the euphoria of having thought they would finally find the killer was quickly followed by yet another setback. The DNA profile of the killer, now dubbed the Saturday Night Strangler by the press, was uploaded to the national database. Would police now get a name?
The DNA profile had been produced, sent off to the database. There were no matches.
The killer's DNA wasn't on the database. But thankfully, another pioneering DNA technique meant all was not lost.
Of course, science and understanding had advanced. We'd been experimenting with the concept of familial DNA, which looks to exploit the similarities between brothers and sisters, parents and their children. So you can actually look for people who are not on the database through their children or their siblings who actually are on the database. They share a similar DNA profile.
While the forensic scientists were searching to find anyone on the national database who had similar DNA to that found on the clothing of the victims, Wynne and his team used good old-fashioned police work to look again at the people of interest from the original case files.
So they went through a long list of suspects who had come into that category, or persons of interest, whether they were owners of 1100s, whether they were associates of the girls, or whether other information came in, sightings, descriptions, everything like that. So what we needed now is to look at any suspects how do we match a suspect against the profile that we've got? And the best way to do that would be to take a blood sample. We're talking about 1973. Not everybody was still alive. Not everybody was still in the area. The team managed to reduce the list of suspects or persons of interest to us down to about 500 or so, and even down way below that as well. And, you know, they would have started going to these people and taking blood samples, and they would have been matched against the profile that we've got.
For the forensic scientists, one family's name on that list stood out. That name was Cappan.
We've got somebody here whose DNA profile is very similar to the man who was of interest to this investigation back in 1973. It was about 50% similar, which is quite a bit. Family member, it couldn't have been him because he would only have been a young boy at the time.
If this man was too young to have committed the murders in the 1970s, could any of his relatives be the killer?
And he actually was the son of this bouncer from Port Talbot called Joseph Cappan. Joe Cappan was a petty criminal. There had been some knowledge of him from police officers who said that he was someone who could be prone to having temper outbreaks and that he could be prone to violence.
Someone who has experienced that violence firsthand is Teresa Fisher. She'd been in a relationship with Joe Cappan in 1983, 10 years after the murders of Geraldine, Pauline and Sandra, and when Teresa herself was only 16 years old, the same age as that of the victims.
This is where I grew up with my gran and grandfather. There's my gran and grandfather's house, where I stayed when I was 16. And I was coming home from the Alex, and I came down here, and then I came up this path, but I could hear Teresa, and he was sitting in his car, and I went to the car. And because my grandfather and my gran in bed, I said, oh, Joe, come over by you, because I didn't want to disturb them. So I walked over here with Joe, and because I was a bit of a fiery girl, and he had upset me, I slapped him as I was standing in this position. So I slapped him. I didn't really know there was a telegraph pole behind me, but out of nowhere, he grabbed me by the neck and held me against the telegraph pole. As soon as he left his hand against my throat, straight away he said, come for a ride, Therese. And a ride I went with him. And that ride at 3 o'clock in the morning was Llandarcy. So to me, I'm just going on exciting rides. I'm 16, never met anyone with a car before. And there I am now going for these rides, which happened often.
But why did Joseph Cappan take the young Teresa that night to the very woods in Llandarcy, where 10 years previously the bodies of Geraldine and Pauline had been found? In January 2000, police had officially reopened the investigations into the double murder of two 16-year-old girls, Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd, as well as the killing of 15-year-old Sandra Newton. All had been raped and strangled, and all by the same man. They now had a DNA profile of the murderer, and through the revolutionary process of familial DNA tracing, one name in particular had surfaced: Joseph Cappan. And frustratingly for South Wales Police, he was a man who lived locally to the murders in 1973 and who owned a particular type of car.
Joseph Cappan actually became a person of interest to the investigation, the original investigation. He owned a 1100 car. Police went to his house, and they probably had the same form as I did to complete. When they went to the house, his vehicle was up on ramps, and they noticed he had a 1100 car. They completed the form. I believe he gave them a false alibi, and he said that his vehicle was not roadworthy.
Now, nearly 30 years later, in 2001, the investigation had come full circle and straight back to Joseph Cappan's doorstep. Had forensics finally led police to the killer of Geraldine, Pauline and Sandra?
When Joseph Cappan became the #1 suspect, the police obviously wanted to trace him, so they went to his house, knocked on the door, and his wife came to the door, and they spoke to her, and she told them that, in fact, Cappan had died 13 years before. He died in 1990 from lung cancer.
Another setback. Police now had to get DNA samples from Cappan's wife and some of his other children in order to see if they could match parts of their DNA to that found on the victim's clothing. But those results proved inconclusive too.
That meant that the only option that remained to them in order to conclusively demonstrate that Joseph Cappan was the killer was to exhume his body. And indeed, they then made an application to the Home Secretary, who was David Blunkett at the time, that they should be allowed to do that. Permission was granted.
Everything was planned. There was operational orders. People were fully aware of how we were going to do it. The tents were erected in Goitre Cemetery to obviously make sure of privacy. Everybody knew what their role was, from the grave diggers to the forensic scientists, to the pathologists, to the senior investigating officers. From the moment that we started, it was incredible, really. There was a clap of thunder, lightning, and a storm. And, you know, it was incredible. I mean, we all looked around and thought, God, where did that come from?
Witnesses who were present at the exhumation say that when the first shovel went in the ground, there was a huge clap of thunder, and those who were present came to the conclusion that they were unearthing evil.
And he was taken then to Morriston Hospital mortuary. I went along to the post-mortem. We took his femur, jawbone and teeth, because that's where we were told that that's where they would obtain the DNA. Within days, we had a result back which was absolutely positive, you know, beyond reasonable doubt. Couldn't have been anybody else.
Finally, after an investigation spanning nearly 30 years, Wynne and his team had solved the mystery of who had raped and killed the three teenagers, Sandra, Geraldine and Pauline, all those years ago, thanks to the game-changing use of familial DNA tracing. A first, not just for South Wales Police, but for worldwide forensic investigators.
It was groundbreaking. This was the very first time in the world that this had been done. And so people were, of course, very proud, both very proud within the police service and, of course, within the scientific community. Proud of what had happened, proud of the science, and I suppose relieved that once and for all, you know, that the victims had actually received some form of closure, and that they knew, albeit the perpetrator was dead, at least the case was closed, and they knew who'd committed these offences.
As the news broke, it shocked the local community. None more so than Teresa Fisher, who had dated Joseph Cappan nearly 20 years earlier, when she was just 16 years old herself. Especially terrifying was the realization that Cappan had taken Teresa to the very places where the victims' bodies had been found.
Joe Cappan drove me to this lane, and this is round about the place where we pulled up, and he left the car. He left the car, and I don't know where he went. He went ahead, and then he came back to the car then with a rock, placed it in my hands, and I put it in the front of the car. He said it was for him to take home for his rockery in the garden. Even though I came here in the day, it still gives me shivers, because this is something that he planned, and I didn't know. I just thought it was just right. But now I can see now, it was him. He was getting thrills out of this without me knowing. And then to think that this is a place where poor Sandra Newton, there's no words. I can't say any words. I can't describe what happened, because I just haven't got no words how to describe it. It just gives me shivers. And you still getting a thrill out of coming back here. We're at the culvert now, where Sandra, poor Sandra, was found. Gives me shivers. And I can't stop thinking about poor Sandra, of what she went through. And realising that man coming back here, he was still getting thrills, but it just gives me shivers now. But when I first came here, I just thought it was a ride. Didn't realise it meant all this. It was just a ride to me. This is the first time I've come back since the police brought me here. In 1983, I found out it must have been probably 10 years close to how everyone lost Sandra. And then finding out then that was 10 years later that he's bringing me here to when he murdered Sandra Newton, another 16-year-old. And to think I'm 16 and he's bringing me here to relive his sick memories.
Memories and questions were all the victims' families had. For nearly 30 years, they'd had no resolution or answers as to why that's all they'd been left with.
They were cherished, loved, you know, they weren't out on the streets, neglected children. They were lovely girls and they were happy and they had their whole lives ahead of them. They'd be in their 60s now, probably grandparents, if he had never encountered them. If only that man had never been born.
Finding out who the killer was gave one answer, but still left many other questions.
There was no trial, so I didn't understand how he did it. How could he have killed two girls at the same time? Why couldn't one have got away? But apparently Jane nearly did get away, and she almost got to the very road, which was 2 minutes to where her father was working that night. So she was almost out of the woods.
No trial, but a kind of justice for the families of Sandra, Pauline and Geraldine. But finding out who killed them left further unanswered questions for investigators. Did Joseph Cappan take even more secrets back to his grave with him?
People who have a liking for violent sexual crime are almost addicted to it. They only stop when they're stopped by law enforcement and in the criminal justice process. Do I think that other investigations should take place? In short, yes. I think these will not be the only cases, the crimes that he committed. I'm pretty sure that there will be others out there.